we have been doing a lot of work on the issues that came from the session. So we saw changes to residential tenancies that are just coming into effect now. So we've been working with housing providers and advocates across the province to talk about the impact of that on Nova Scotians. We saw an announcement on coastal protection, and of course, a lot of folks who still aren't very happy with how that's landing. So we've been doing that work. I'm actually headed to Northern Nova Scotia for an economic development conference next week and some meetings from Oxford to Pugwash, so I'll be somewhere in your neck of the woods. But listen, continuing the work of making sure that Nova Scotians are having their voices heard. And to be honest, a lot of what we've been hearing, of course, is about the tariffs and what's going on south of the border, which continues to be an issue, but also about healthcare, which I think we talked about wasn't, really present in the last most recent election, but which continues to be a big issue for a lot of people.
And all of those issues, of course, as you say, were talked about in the House in one fashion or another. The Coastal Protection Act is one that's been kind of a political football. The Liberals came up with the legislation, but they didn't enact it. And then the Tories came in and they didn't enact it. And, it begs the question, where do we go from here? They've been spending money provincially, that is, in providing guidelines and what they call example bylaws. And I don't know if you're aware, but we're very much aware in Cumberland County that Cumberland has been very much a leader in terms of municipal planning, land use bylaws, even coastal protection bylaws, way ahead of most having comprehensive bylaws. And so a couple of times it's come up in the county council say, well, we have a law for that on the coast. What if ours is different than the province? And I asked, I asked the Premier that question lately, and he said that's why we're letting the municipalities take care of it, because they know better what they need to do in their own municipal units. And he said whatever they choose for themselves would be the appropriate thing. Which begs the question, the very fact that municipalities over the years, most of them did nothing. And if that's what they're left to do, nothing's not accomplishing anything at all, is it?
Well, listen, I'm really happy for the question, and this is a place where I differ very sharply with the Premier, and I don't think his words add up, Bill, because when I talk to municipal leaders from Pictou to Yarmouth to, Northern Cape Breton, what everyone will say is actually what we need is a provincial approach. And so this idea, the reason that the Coastal Protection Act was not proclaimed right away is that the regulations needed to be developed that were sensitive to local, regional realities, but that fell under a comprehensive provincial framework for exactly the reason that you raised, so that we don't have a situation where municipalities do nothing. And to be fair, some of the municipalities who do nothing just don't have the capacity. There are lots of municipal units that have no planning staff, really. And so they just don't have the capacity. So I think there are moves being made to increase, incrementally that capacity, but that is categorically not what municipalities asked for. And, like the example that you gave, the municipality of the District of Lunenburg is another one that has shown leadership. But if you talk to a lot of those councillors, they'll say that they did that not because they wanted to, not because they really felt like that's what their council should be doing, but because there was a vacuum and a lack of leadership from the province, and they had to. And now they're going to be stuck in an uneven patchwork where their bylaws may or may not be the same as a neighboring municipality, and it's a mess. So I think this has been a real failure on the part of this government.
Now, it's interesting that you noted Lunenburg County, because in my background as a radio guy, I started out in the radio station in Bridgewater, and I was there in the 1970s when municipal planning, they hired their first municipal planner in the county, and they took leadership in the province at the time, as you suggest. Then I end up at the end of my career in Cumberland County, where they too took the bull by the horns and said, we've got to do something about about this, and they have a very comprehensive set of land use bylaws and so on they're really living documents. There's not a council meeting goes by where there's not an application to make a modification to those things, which suggests that, they're not cut in stone and last forever, but they respond to the public need. And these are not issues that people like to just chew on for the sake of chewing on, because whenever you restrict somebody's use of their own land, you're setting up for a fight. So is it fair for me to say that maybe the Liberals and the Conservatives didn't want to enact the bylaws or come up with the rules because they knew they would be offending somebody? Is this one of those, let's not touch it because it'll come back to burn us?
I think that sounds about right to me, but I think that's the benign explanation. I think there's also lots of conversation about who stands to benefit from this, right? The people who benefit from these gaps are people who have the money to build along the coast. And increasingly, that's not everyday Nova Scotians. That's not most of us. So, the reality is we're a coastal province. We all feel ownership over all of our coasts, and we have it. We have access to the water, or we ought to, and we need to protect our province. And so, absolutely, Bill, I think, governments never want to be unpopular. They never want to, pick a fight with powerful people. And this is certainly a place where that would have had to happen, but it's a place where that may need to happen in service of, the more than 1 million people who live in our beautiful coastal province. And unfortunately, we just haven't seen that leadership, which really is required in this area.
Now, of course, a lot of people, both those who have purchased land along the coast and those who maybe inherited as family property, they've had dreams perhaps for years and years. Some went out west and made their fortune, bought a piece of land along the coast with a dream of coming home, and maybe it was going to be a cottage, but eventually it's going to be a home. And now the question is, can I build right on that rock? Can I build where I can see the waves? Or do I back up a little bit? And people will say, it's been like that forever, but it's changing. Climate change has changed everything. And we can't sit back and say, we've always been able to deal with this issue. We have not. We've been dealing with the rising insurance rates, which are pooled rates for everyone. And every time we have a hurricane and we lose land and property and houses and homes and cottages, that drives up the home insurance rates for everybody, even those who aren't on the coast. So it's a public issue now, and it needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and I think increasingly, actually, the vast majority of coastal property owners want that guidance. They want to understand where they might be at risk. They don't want to build if they can't insure their property. And so, this really is something that for the vast majority of people is needed, would be helpful. And, you're right. Climate, we are facing climate change, and our coasts are the most vulnerable, but we need them to protect the rest of our province. So we need those coastal areas to remain healthy. We need to understand how we take care of that in the face of sea level rise, in the face of changing weather. So this is an area where we need action. And, it's interesting, there was a coastal protection rally last year in front of Province House, and I'll tell you, it was not the usual suspects. So the Premier lately has liked to talk about, special interests and professional protesters. That's not who was at this rally. This was, 70-year-old municipal councillors from the town of Pictou. This was, municipal elected leaders from all across the province showing up at a protest for many, maybe the first one, to say, you promised us something and you're not delivering it. And so I'm sure that they will keep pushing, and we'll certainly keep pushing on their behalf to have provincial leadership around how we deal with our coast.
Now, you just said something interesting about pushing and leadership, and the leadership is the Premier at this point in time, and the pushing is you, the opposition leader. And I guess we really wouldn't be fair if I just let you push and not tell us what would you do if you were the leader. Oh,
well, we would enact the Coastal Protection Act. At this point, the act is probably 5 or 6 years old. So obviously we'd have to make sure that it's still relevant, but we would absolutely enact a provincial piece of legislation with relevant bylaws that we would develop through consultation regulations for all of the different regions in our province. That was the original plan. It's the one that makes sense. It's the one that municipalities want and that will serve Nova Scotians. And it's one that absolutely we would enact quickly when we're given that chance.
Now, having said that, you mentioned much earlier about tariffs and the impact they're having, and the actual fear they're having is more than the impact at present. But, that's really into the federal jurisdiction, and we're in the midst of a federal campaign that will be decided next Monday. And one wonders then, from your perspective in Nova Scotia, looking at the federal election campaign, the question of who can best take on Mr. Trump, who can best take on the impact of the tariffs, what's your perspective?
Well, my perspective is that we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to have a resilient local economy here in Nova Scotia. And I think there are so many ways that we could continue to be working on that. I mean, I think the Premier has said a lot of the right things when it comes to kind of the work we need to do, but I think we're only seeing some of that work done. So in my district, in Dartmouth, we're aware of a multi-million dollar contract that just got signed with an American company to do major work on one of our harbor bridges. We don't understand if that's really been reviewed. There's some suggestion that there's no Canadian company who could do that. I have a hard time believing that. But I think we have to continue really to look at, where are we sourcing things from? How do our procurement policies work? How are we really incentivizing people taking advantage of our local food and our local wine? How are we incentivizing our local producers? Because one of our issues is food, right? Like we don't have enough food to feed ourselves here in this province for very long. And so we want to make sure that we're building capacity. We want to make sure that we're supporting our farmers, that we're supporting our forestry, that we are doing everything we can to make our own economy resilient. So, I think whoever is here, it's always a little bit hard because we're not a strong bloc from the perspective of Ottawa. But, we just need someone who's going to continue to stand up and fight, or a collection of someone's, and we'll see who those folks are on Monday.
Now, having said that, I know this is a really tough question for me. It's easy for me to ask, tough for you to answer. But you're the leader of the NDP in Nova Scotia. The NDP, nationally speaking, has played a pretty strong role in the last government in a kind of partnership with the Liberals. They appeared, according to the polls and pundits and reports, to be in some great difficulty, which means, of course, that it's perhaps a toss-up. I have my personal view of what's going to happen. I'll hold up back on that. But a toss-up between the two, the Liberals and the Conservatives. What do you do as leader of a provincial NDP when you look at that and think, who do I support? How do I relate to these people that I'm normally opposed to when you have to work with them in the long run? How do you deal with that?
Oh, well, politics is, you always have to work across party lines to get things done in politics. I've done that my entire political career. That won't stop now. I think, the New Democrat campaigns in Nova Scotia are talking about things people care about. I think New Democrats in the last parliament, delivered on things like pharmacare and dental care that Canadians really care about. We'll see what happens in this election. But, in lots of parts of this province, we have politicians of different stripes in every order of government, and in many cases they figure out ways to work together because at the end of the day they represent their communities. And at the end of the day, my concern is for Nova Scotians, and I'll work with whoever is open to it and has good ideas to help the people of this province and our economy.
Speaking of the economy, I see this whole crisis brought on by Trump as an opportunity for Canada for us to finally take a good hard look at ourselves and recognize that we've put up provincial barriers to trade east to west. We've got all kinds of silly laws that prohibit us from selling across the border and on and on. And I think if we begin to look at Canada as one, as Canada, that we have an opportunity here to strengthen our country in a fashion like never before. Is that a reasonable point?
I think so, Bill. And I think, again, one of the silver linings is, we just came through a pretty fractious period during COVID. Fractious politically, people feeling isolated and separated from each other. And I think we are seeing people rally around the flag. I think we are seeing people feel a sense of provincial identity and national identity. And I think that's important. I think it's important for people to feel proud of the place where they live and to want to work to make it better. And so I think you've correctly identified that, the job of government is to create the policies and levers for that to actually be able to happen. So I think there's lots of opportunity to do that. And I think we'll be looking to see more of that opportunity engaged with, for sure.
It's interesting, too, to say that because, of course, ever since, say, the 1970s, we've had an odd situation in our country with the province of Quebec. And that the threat of separation, the rise of the provincial government and a federal, so-called federal party that is exclusively within Quebec, and they've always had their own perspective. And yet we're seeing lately people in Quebec are thinking Canadian for perhaps the first time in 30, 40 years. And that's from that I think in terms of we might begin to rethink about who we are as Canadians.
Totally. I mean, I had a really funny experience watching the English CBC debate with my kids and explaining to them what the Bloc is and explaining to them who the leader was. And they were just mystified, like they didn't understand. And I do think that's positive. I think we have a strong and very diverse federation, and we need to find ways to make that work. And we're a microcosm of that here in Nova Scotia. We're a strong and very diverse province. And, I hope a silver lining is that, the divisive kind of rhetoric that I feel like we were hearing from Tim Houston at the beginning of this last legislative session has pretty much been repudiated. People want someone who is going to represent Nova Scotia, who's going to bring us together. That's certainly what we're trying to do, and I'm hopeful that we're going to see a move in that direction as a province.